takes place, and the lands of wherever you are watching from. Today we have a seminar hosted by Nick Olsen. A little bit about Nick. He is the newest member of our Stats Central team, and he comes to us having earned a PhD in neuroscience, and he focused on emotion learning and memory in that work. He's worked as a lecturer in biomedical sciences and in biostatistics. Most recently, he spent time working with data in public health research, focusing on analyzing randomized clustered controlled trials in the prevention of drug use in adolescents, and analyzing risk factor outcome relationships for drug use in mental health outcomes. He'll be working closely with researchers and students in the School of Clinical Medicine at St. Vincent's Clinical Campus. So if you're joining us from there, you'll see a lot of Nick during your time at St. Vincent's. He also will be doing handling some of our general consultations. So if you aren't at St. Vincent's, you still might get to work with him if you come to us for some general help. Today he's going to be talking to us about what you can do if you've got data that doesn't come from an RCT, but you'd like to be able to talk about causality in the way that an RCT allows, that other research designs don't. So Nick, please take it away.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining the talk today. This might be of interest to some of you guys. So it's great to see some interest. I'm just going to get full screen. Okay. All right. Okay. So first slide. So what if we can't run a randomized control trial? So there's various situations where that might happen. So for example, we might be interested in the effect of alcohol use on, say, cardiovascular events. Now, we can't run an RCT giving people alcohol. That's unethical. Some people could, get alcohol use disorder and so on. So that's not going to happen. Same with smoking or air pollution or those sorts of things. Other good reasons might be cost. So obviously, as you probably know, RCTs are very expensive. And it can cost a lot of money per participant, which can also limit sample size, by the way. So, and also time and resources. So, those are some pretty good reasons why you don't have RCTs. We don't have access to RCTs easily. they take some work to get to. Okay, so that leaves us sometimes with observational studies. Which are good, but there's some problems with observational studies. So starting with confounders. So, if we're talking about the alcohol example, people who abstain from alcohol might be abstaining because they have health problems or because they know something, family history of alcohol problems, or they had alcohol problems or other health problems. Heavy drinkers might have less motivation to adhere to health guidelines, for example. Different socioeconomic background, gender, difference in smoking rates, also these sorts of things need to be adjusted for. Now, traditionally, this has been done by what you might have done before, regular covariate adjustment, where you might have, say, multivariable linear or logistic regression, say, in a classic example. All right, so that would normally work between the confounder and the disease outcome, so breaking the indirect link between the exposure and outcome. Now, propensity score methods is what I'm going to be talking about today. They work on the other side. So propensity score methods, so I'm going to be talking about inverse probability of treatment weighting. That works on balancing baseline covariates. Okay, and so that breaks the link between the indirect link between the exposure and outcome in theory. By the way, it's a cool, you can also combine these. So you can use what's called doubly robust methods, where you include propensity methods and conventional outcome regression to get what's called a doubly robust estimate. So if one of these methods fails, the other one that is there as a backup, so you're less likely to misspecify the model and you get better precision. So that's also possible. Okay, so we're going to be talking about inverse probability of treatment weighting. Now, what that does, it allows us to generate pseudo populations for each treatment group with similar or balanced covariates collected at baseline. Okay, so just a bit of history on it. It started being published, around 2000 or so. Started to take off. I've got another graph following that, so that goes up to 2012. This second graph is IPTW methods just in atrial fibrillation, so oral anticoagulants and stuff. So that kind of technique is also increased, and it's going up and up. So starting to get some to become more and more popular. Okay, so first of all, I thought I'd just get straight into how do you make IPTW, how do you make these weights, and then go from there. So first, you can use software. So R has a package, IPW or Weightit. Weightit's really good, has a lot of options there. Stata has something called T-effects. I'm sure other software has other macros. So first step is simply a logistic regression with group as your outcome. So for example, if you had two groups, treatment and control, treatment might be 1 and control might be 0. And then you do a logistic regression on that. So your outcome is actually the group they're in. This is at baseline. It sounds a bit strange, but you're predicting group based on their other covariates. And the covariates as predictors. Now, if you have, say, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 treatment groups, that's also totally fine. You just do multinomial logistic regression. Okay, so just a quick note, a technical note. I don't want to go into this too much, but if the covariates you're going to be entering to predict your outcome variable, you want to focus first on using covariates that are actually related to your outcome variable. So the whole point of this method is to sort of reduce confounding. So what you want to do is take out those covariates that could be confounders. And how do you do that? There's various methods, no right or wrong way, but it's been suggested you could use, for example, the standardized mean difference, or it's like an effect size greater than 0.1. So if your covariate is predicting somewhat the outcome, your outcome variable, whatever it is, then you might want to include that as a covariate to balance. Or you could use P is less than 0.2. There's no right or wrong. There's other methods you could use as well. Okay, so just a quick thing, when you're generating these IPTW weights, you don't need to worry about collinearity, because what we're trying to do is just calculate the outcome probability for each person of being in group 1 treatment or group 0 control. We're not really interested in how each covariate individually affects that. So after we've run our logistic model, we just calculate our predicted probability. So it's just the derivative of it's just basically the outcome of your model. So that's it. So you get the predicted probability of being in the treatment group. If you were in fact in the treatment group, then you calculate probability of being in the control group if you were in fact in the control group. So might sound strange. What am I talking about? I'll try to explain here. So on the bottom x-axis here, we have propensity score, PS. And so the treated group, some of these people if all we knew about them was the baseline covariates, we could predict that these people have a higher probability of being in the treatment group, okay? And these people down here have a lower probability of being in the treatment group, okay? And what's interesting is some of these people over here in the untreated, in the control group, actually have a higher propensity score than some of these people in the treated group. So that's interesting, right? So we've got, so what we're going to do is upweight, if you like, unrepresentative cases. So for example, unrepresentative controls, so people who are actually less likely to be control and more likely to be in treatment, these people will be upweighted later, and people who were highly likely to be in control will downweight those people. So this line here, after weighting, this is the propensity score histogram. But after weighting, these are gonna be flatter. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. Hope that makes sense. Now, one quick issue here is that there's sometimes some non-overlapping areas. So this is a concern. So if your distributions don't overlap, that can be a violation of positivity. And I'll explain what that means later. And we might need to trim these weights over here, exclude these cases essentially. Okay, so step 3, calculate the weight. So that's simply the inverse of the propensity score. So the only equation I've got here today is this one here. So the inverse probability of treatment weight is 1 divided by the propensity score for subjects who receive treatment, and 1 divided by 1 minus the propensity score, which equals the probability of being control if you have 2 groups, for subjects who receive the control. And that's it. So if it might make more sense graphically. So in this is just from a paper where they had people who took who had hemodialysis. CHD is conventional hemodialysis, EHD is extended hemodialysis. And in the original sample, pink means diabetic. So we've got 3 people who are diabetic in the conventional and 1 person who isn't. In the extended, we had 3 people who are not diabetic and 1 person who was. So we want to balance that. So what we do is do inverse probability weighting, and then we upweight these people who are diabetic in the CHD group a little bit, only by 1.33, and upweight the non-diabetic group by a factor of 4. So we have 4 people here, and we've got 3 times 1.33. So we've got a pseudo population of 4 diabetic and 4 non-diabetic in the CHD group, and on the extended hemodialysis group, we've got we have to upweight this person by 4. So we upweight the diabetic by 4 and upweight the non-diabetic by 1.33. Now we've got covariate balance, which is really nice. So we've got an equal number of diabetic and non-diabetic participants at baseline. So hope that's starting to explain it a little. We can talk at the end as well if you have questions. Okay, so next step, I highly recommend stabilizing your weight. So that gives you an inverse probability of treatment weighting, which is has less extreme weights, and it preserves your sample size. So to get this, just multiply your weight by the overall probability of being in the treatment or control group. So for example, if your sample is 60% treatment at baseline and 40% control, just multiply the treatment group by 0.6 and the control group by 0.4. Okay, and that's going to give you a stabilized weight with a mean of 1 if there's no positivity violations, which we'll talk about later. And one nice thing is we get to preserve our original sample size with stabilized weights. Okay. Okay, so covariate balance. So this is what, getting back to that study we were talking about just then with the extended hemodialysis versus the conventional. So if you have pink, if you just look at the pink dots first, on the bottom we have absolute standardized mean difference. So that means, well, how does each of these covariates on the left differ between the 2 groups, the extended or the conventional? And so some of these covariates are very different. So age is very different. We've got a effect size of over 0.5 before weighting. Now, after we've done our adjusting, the age is there's almost no difference in age anymore. Similar with the other covariates, we're really reducing their baseline differences. So they're nice and balanced. So the difference between the 2 groups after doing the inverse probability weighting is much lower. So still some quite small mean differences here. And sometimes if you work really hard on your model, you can sometimes get them really close to 0. Okay, so that's what you do. You enter all of the covariates that are of interest at a time when you're creating your IPTW weights. Okay, moving on. So other nice little things, interaction terms also tend to be balanced after you do inverse probability of treatment weighting. But you can also check for that. And if not, then you can just put the interaction term in the model, and then that will become balanced, which is nice. You can also use your outcome variable to balance on, only if it's at the baseline measurement. Okay, so you can get your outcome measurement to be equal at baseline. You've just got to be careful not to use that when you're actually looking at follow-up outcomes. Now, one nice thing about that is that I don't see that this discussed very much in the literature, but I think it's a really important point, is that when you balance your outcome variable, you're reducing ceiling and floor effects, right? So if you have a logistic regression, you might have a lot of people who have a 0 or a 1 in one group versus another, and so you're less likely to see a treatment effect in one direction. And also linear regressions technically have an unboundedness assumption. So if your outcome is a linear model, ceiling and floor effects still can play a role there, because in the real world, a lot of outcomes that we find are actually bounded by strong parameters. So and also not only does weighting it works on the outcome variable, but also differential bounding effects on covariates, so ceiling and floor effects on our covariates. It helps to remove those problems. Now, just getting to RCTs for a moment. So in RCTs, we sometimes see small differences in covariates between groups, but they tend to be small, especially with larger samples, and they occur by chance due to randomization. And these differences are not dependent on treatment group, which is a really important point. Whereas in observational studies, confounders can affect both treatment and outcome, and so balancing is much more important theoretically. Okay, so this is a big slide with a lot of text, but the conditions of using IPTWs comes back to some kind of important principles of causal inference. So I'm just going to go through these. The first on exchangeability. This just means no unmeasured confounders. So what this means is exposed and unexposed subjects must have equal probability distributions of outcome at baseline. So before you actually get treatment or control or get whatever it is, or exposure, so before that happens, you should have an theoretically equal probability distribution of your outcome variable. So think hard about that when you're designing a study. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a really important thing to think about. Now, there's no formal test for unmeasured confounding. Tips to get around that is just collect more covariates. A baseline tends to be good. And so that means there's less probability of encountering unmeasured confounding, but it can still exist. So you need to think carefully, theoretically, about your subject matter. Positivity, this is really important for IPTW. So every individual should have technically a non-zero probability of being in either treatment or control, but in practice, like a reasonable probability. So every combination of covariates should be possible in every level of exposure and in every treatment or control group. So if there's a risk factor, such as an absolute contraindication to receive a treatment, then this person would have a very low chance of being in the treatment group. So that would violate the positivity assumption, because this person would be very, very unlikely to actually receive treatment. So you'd want to make your study, you'd want to maybe have any strata or risk factors which highly push you in one direction or the other. Take those out. So you can in your study, you could design it such that you're going to exclude participants whose age under 18 or whose age over 80, or have some contraindication for a drug, something that's going to push them, make it very unlikely to be in a treatment or a control group. That can also happen for combinations of covariates. Okay, consistency. This applies all the time. So I like this definition. Exposure is defined with enough specificity that different variants of the exposure do not have different effects on the outcome. So good examples, postmenopausal women who initiate hormone replacement therapy, they're at higher risk of coronary heart disease and stroke in the first 5 years after initiating therapy, but lower risk after 5 years. So you have this sort of lagged effect. So depending on when you initiate treatment and when you measure outcomes, that's going to have a huge effect. Another example might be thrombolytic drugs. They're more effective than PCI, but only within a short time period after symptom onset, I think less than 2 hours or so. So that's consistency. So exchangeability and positivity, these are just normally dealt with by randomization. So we don't really need to think about this too much in RCTs. Ben talked about, not Ben, sorry, Mark talked about this in the last talk. And consistency will also be dealt with if we define our outcomes and treatment in RCT. So we need to pay really careful attention to all of these conditions if we're going to be using IPTW in observational studies. So what can happen is sometimes you can get extreme weights. Now this can happen if you have a violation of positivity, or if you have a mean weight which is different from one, highly different from one, that can also suggest positivity violations. So you can, first of all, good practice here, when you notice something like this has happened, go and examine those cases, and also examine covariates to figure out what could be causing a violation of positivity here. If it's a follow-up study and they're at a school that's not a great example, but if they had a exclusion criteria or something like that, you could take out those cases, just like you would in an RCT or a meta-analysis. You can define your analysis. Okay, so with trimming, so getting back to this, how do we deal with extreme weights? You can trim your weights. So that means the maximum weight might be 5 times. You might just choose a cutoff, or by truncating, say, the top 2% or top and bottom 2% of weights, or 5%. There's no right or wrong rule. So there's a bias variance trade-off here, and it's going to vary with each data set you have. Trimming these weights is going to reduce your variance, but it's going to increase bias and vice versa. So it's an optimization problem. All right, now with this, it's hard to pre-specify exactly how much trimming you're going to need. You might not have many extreme weights. It might be really well balanced and no positivity problems. That's fine, but you might have a few extreme weights. And it's easier to do this post hoc. So when I say post hoc, I mean after you've got your baseline data. So after you've got that, you can start to do this. If you get it all in one block, maybe you might want to use an external statistician. So you're not kind of choosing the trimming to get an optimal outcome. But so I hope that makes sense. I just have to go a bit, get through this talk. So I have to move on, but feel free to ask later. Okay, so we can also use IPTWs in randomized control trials. So if you have really big differences in baseline covariates, so sometimes in cluster randomization, for example, I was looking at school-based trials in the past, and you can have different schools with very different characteristics, which can lead to very different big differences in covariates, especially if you didn't have stratification in your design, or even if you did, you can still get these some big baseline differences in covariates. So perhaps in a sensitivity analysis or a pre-planned use of this, you could use IPTW to increase model precision by improving baseline covariate balance. So if you just, another way of thinking about it is, well, how can we be sure that the school who got the treatment actually ended up better? How do we know that it wasn't just because they were different and had a lot more females? Right, so it helps you answer that alternative hypothesis. Okay, another possible reason you can use IPTW in RCTs is to estimate treatment effects in specific target populations. Based on RCTs, like say a big RCT from a big population, you might just be interested in how it affects a certain subgroup. And so instead of running up a whole new RCT, you could just target that particular population of interest. Okay, another really important thing if you're going to be looking at using IPTW is what treatment effect are you interested in? So the average treatment effect, the ATE. So IPTW models will estimate the average treatment effect kind of by default. So what's the effect of treatment? That means what's the effect of treatment if everyone in the population shifts from untreated to treated? So that's the average treatment effect. And we tend to use these for sort of population-based measures. There's also the average treatment effect on the treated. So what is the treatment effect in everyone who is treated compared to the counterfactual situation of these same people not receiving treatment? So there's a great example in the literature of a smoking cessation treatment. So ATT is probably more appropriate in people who have come to seek treatment compared to the whole smoking population, because they're actually the people who are highly motivated to stop smoking and are probably not representative of the whole smoking population. But you still could use IPTW in this sort of case. So there's a slight mathematical variation. It's very simple still. So if for ATT, if you receive treatment, you have a weight of 1. And if you didn't have treatment, you have a weight of the odds of being in the treatment group. Okay, so in an RCT, interestingly, the ATT and the ATE converge due to the randomization process. But we need to specify which treatment we want to uncover if we're using IPTW in observational studies. Okay, so other uses of propensity scores. I've talked about IPTW. You can also do adjusting with the propensity weight. So you can actually just use the IPTW weight as a covariate and just do normal regression. You can do propensity score matching. So you might have seen a lot of studies used to do matching and still do sometimes. You can match on the propensity score. So you need matching algorithms for that. A bit more complicated. Stratification on the propensity score as well. You can make quartiles or quintiles on propensity scores and then compare across the strata. IPTW has a few advantages. It allows comparing multiple treatment groups easily and allows time to event kind of outcomes as well. There's also lots of different variants of IPTW you have, or similar concepts like overlap weights, entropy weights. Overlap weights are sort of specifically for covariate balancing, but I won't go into that too much. So just a few tips. If you do happen to use IPTW, what are some tips to do it well? So first of all, ask yourself, do we want to calculate the average treatment effect of the whole population shifting from untreated to treated, or the average treatment effect of treatment in the people who were treated? So to ask that first, because it's going to determine what model you use. Collect enough covariates at baseline to reduce the probability of unmeasured confounding. I'd suggest that if you can. Important point I haven't mentioned, try to use bootstrapped standard errors. They're the best empirically, or robust standard errors. So don't use just regular standard errors. That will give you biased results, and yeah, so don't do that. Have a sample size which is big enough, so at least 150 ideally in literature, or if you have to, if you can't get more than that, at least 100. Next is to plot your standardized mean difference as a diagnostic. So after you've done your treatment weighting, how does that affect the balance of covariates? And if it's still a bit unbalanced, you could consider adding other covariates which are predictive of group or interaction terms. Play around with it a little bit, and that's fine. Check groups for the overlap of propensity scores. We want to have our propensity scores overlapping and not huge areas where they're not overlapping. Okay. I would suggest using stabilized weights, as I mentioned earlier. Censoring and missing data affect the performance of IPTW. So you can account for this with things like multiple mutation, other missingness strategies, or inverse probability of censoring weighting. So you can just calculate weights for actually missingness And sometimes this is done in marginal structural models over time. And you can just multiply the censoring weights by the treatment weights. And then you've done all of that. You've accounted for both missingness and treatment allocation. And you get the overall weights if you use that approach. And finally, I'd suggest using doubly robust approaches. It doesn't hurt to also look at the effect of confounding on the confounding covariate on the outcome as well. So I would also include when you're doing your outcome regression, also include important confounders. Okay, so summary, IPTW helps with causal inference, but we really need to be careful of positivity violations. I'd say that's probably the biggest issue in this field. And exchangeability, so not unmeasured confounding. IPTW are really easy to use. I've found them, they're very, very quick to calculate. It's not too complicated, simple process. It gives really good balance in your covariates. It's really great. And also get in touch. So if you'd like any help with this, just to shout out, send me an email, and I'd be more than happy to help anybody with that. So thanks. That's it. And so feel free to ask any questions if you have any.
Yeah, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask.
Here we go. What stats package? I used, I did this with Stata. I actually did it all manually. I just enjoy doing that. But yeah, so I use Stata, but R is really great and has a lot of options as well. I'd recommend those two. I know they're both good for this. I'm sure other packages are fine, but I can suggest those two.
There. Any other questions?
Did any of that make sense? Missing data. So yeah, thanks, Beck. You can certainly do multiple imputation. It's a good strategy. There's or you can use the maximum likelihood method, or you could use the inverse probability of censoring weighting, which is a very similar idea, except instead of treatment as your outcome, it's just missing as your outcome. And you can get censoring weights in very quickly. Really similar procedure, actually. And then you just multiply the censoring weights by the treatment weights to get your overall weights, and then you apply that to your model. But yeah, it's important to address missing data, because IPTW empirically has been shown to not work as well if you have a lot of missing data. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, with survey weights as well. If you do have, I guess you can also multiply by survey weights. I was thinking about this, like, so for example, in RCTs, even RCTs, you could potentially use survey weights. Like, we know that there's response bias in RCTs. A lot of people who join an RCT might have lower risk factors. Some studies have shown that sometimes. And so you might want to apply a survey weight as well, which might be an idea. So you can upweight people who are less likely to be in the RCT, but were. So that's a good point. Yeah. So why do I think positivity violations is more of a problem? I guess what I meant is unmeasured confounding is always a problem. With positivity, well, it's not always a problem. I shouldn't say that. In RCTs, it's not something we need to worry too much about because of the randomization process. So that's definitely, but it's definitely important. But from my experience, I had heaps of baseline covariates, and there was nothing else I could think of that could be affecting our outcomes. But if you haven't collected that many covariates and you can think of other things that can cause your outcomes, then that would be a big problem, right? So if you don't have that many baseline covariates, you have some complex multifactorial sort of outcome variable, then that would definitely be a problem. So I was probably a little biased to what I've done before there. But positivity is also really quite important. You need to sort of check. That's something you can check for empirically here. So you can look at the propensity score overlap. For example, you can look for extreme weights, or if your mean stabilized weight is far from 1, you can actually check these things and you can address them. So you might find covariate strata or combinations of covariate strata, which make it really, really unlikely to be treated, or really, really unlikely not to be treated. And then you can just take those out and exclude them. And that's totally fine. But yeah, no, that's a fair point. A good question you asked just then, because yeah, if there could be unmeasured confounding, well, then that is definitely going to be a big problem. So, no, thank you. Is there ever a context where you might wish to estimate ATU, so average treatment effect on the untreated? I don't have an example off the top of my head. Does anybody else? It is something you can calculate. I don't see it used very much. Sometimes called ATC, does exist. Nothing comes to mind. If anyone wants to jump in there, please feel free if you have an example off the top of your head. I should have thought of that. It does happen, but yeah, good question, Kim. I'm not sure. Yeah. Perhaps in an observational study, yeah, possibly. What would happen to the people who weren't treated? Yeah, maybe some health economists might be interested as well. If we could shift these people who didn't get treatment to getting treatment, what would the benefit be? Yeah, I can imagine that sort of thing being examined. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Oh,
Server designs, yeah. Yeah. Other alternative designs, yeah, we can certainly share the slides. We're going to put them up on our Stat Central website. Yeah. So different study designs or study types. To be honest, I just prepared for IPTW. What else? Yeah, anybody else? Feel free to jump in from Stat Central. Someone mentioned crossover designs. These are great as well. So the crossover design for an RCT is where you're getting treatment and control, but only one at a time. And so that's really taking out that individual level variability. So it's a really nice design, but it can sometimes be hard to interpret long-term outcomes from that. So there's issues with the interpretation, but it's a great design as well. Can you apply IPTW retrospectively? Absolutely. To an observational database? Yeah, definitely you can. I'd recommend it. You might want to blind yourself somehow to the follow-up data. So if you can get your baseline data to generate your IPTW weights, that's a good thing to do. Now, there's also it's just sort of a debate here. You can also sort of empirically, with your baseline covariates, you can use them just in a simple regression to predict your outcome. And then if there's baseline covariates predict your outcome, then you go, well, these are potential confounders. I'm going to put them into my IPTW propensity score model so that I can balance on these covariates. I would just be careful that you're not sort of including your treatment in those regressions. So you don't want your treatment you don't want to be looking at what do these things do to my treatment, right? When I run them in a regression, you want to be blind to that so maybe just look at the your other covariates, right? If you're going to be, if you want to use an empirical approach to use to decide which covariates to include when you're generating your propensity scores. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah, but yeah, definitely you can use IPTW retrospectively. So yeah. So Jennifer, what did I say again? Oh yeah, the difference that, yeah, so Nancy mentions here that we can think about this for a future seminar. Yeah, great question. Any others? I hope it made sense. I'm sorry I had to sort of rush through all those slides, but basically we're sort of upweighting people who are less likely to be in one group or the other.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick, for your presentation. It was very informative, enjoyed it. And thank you all for attending. We'll put the slides and a link to the video on our website if you would like to download those or watch this again later. Thank you very much.
Guys.